Okay, thank you everyone. Welcome back. Please take your seats and we're going to get going only slightly behind schedule as usual for these kind of events. It's lovely to see you all. I see many familiar faces, but also many unfamiliar faces. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Eric Reese. I've been an associate with CHI since 2019. So since the beginning with CHI, and seen many changes and challenges over the years, but I'm very pleased as always to see an ever-growing community of folks here for the Impact Forum. I have one logistical note before I kick off, which is that there is also an art session happening at the same time here. I will only be slightly offended if you leave and want to do that instead of this, but you can come and go as you please. It's in the Ada Salter Suite. You can ask the team if you're interested in seeing that at this time. So it is my job to introduce the second session today, which is going to focus on secondary prevention. One of the big questions that we have for working in homelessness is how do we identify those at risk and prevent homelessness before it happens? And secondary prevention, we're thinking of in terms of continuing Lygia's analogy from before. If you're thinking about the pot that's boiling, it's right before boiling. Maybe we can see some steam. We suspect things are boiling soon, but we need to take some action before. So what we're going to talk about in this session is in two mini sessions. Our first is going to be kicked off by some remarks from former Minister Eddie Hughes from his perspective on how to work with communities. And our second mini session is going to focus on everyone's favorite topic, data, which is actually my favorite topic in reality. So I'm very excited to talk with all of you about that today. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Eddie to kick us off. And please join me in welcoming former Minister Eddie Hughes.
Well, good afternoon. I'm glad they delayed the start of that session so you were fully caffeinated. It's nothing worse than talking to an audience who are desperate for a coffee and a pastry. And it is a pleasure for me to be here. I'm delighted, grateful to Lygia and the team for inviting me to join you. I had professional experience in homelessness prevention working for the YMCA before I became an MP, and then when I became an MP and minister, subsequently the opportunity to shape policy for the government and try to aid delivery. Unfortunately, though, my speech this morning really focuses on the fact that sometimes politicians just don't do prevention. And to begin, I thought I'd use a metaphor because metaphors seem to be the theme of the day. And in my case, it comes in the form of the first verse of a poem. Now, I'm a John Denver fan, and I heard him recite this poem at one of his concerts, and you'll understand the point. It's called The Ambulance Down in the Valley. And the first verse goes like this. 'Twas a dangerous cliff, as they freely confessed, though to walk near its crest was quite pleasant. Over the edge slipped a duke and a prince, and it had fooled many a peasant. So the people all said something had to be done, but their projects did not at all tally. Some said, put a fence round the edge of the cliff. Others, an ambulance down in the valley. And unfortunately, because of the crises that politicians face these days, they spend all too much time focused on the ambulance down in the valley rather than the fence around the edge of the cliff. Now, I have to say, my own early experience of prevention came when I got elected in 1999 as a councillor on Walsall Council. I had 2 young kids at the time, so I eagerly embraced the idea that I was now a corporate parent with responsibility for the looked after children in the care of Walsall Council. I got to know 2 young lads, and when they were making the transition from being in care to living independently, I asked if it was okay for me to go and visit them in their flat. And I have to say, I was surprised to find that they had the full bells and whistles Sky TV package, which I thought was extortionately expensive. And so it proved, because just a couple of months later, they were getting into rent arrears because they just couldn't afford this TV package. I got the council team, legal team to intervene and get them out of a service contract that they should never have been in the first place. And it served to me as an excellent example how just a simple early intervention can prevent somebody from getting in further arrears and ultimately being evicted. And I took that learning with me when I got elected in 2017, and then subsequently when I became a whip and a minister. Now, the first part of my promotion was when I got a call from the Chief Whip in February 2020. And he offered me a job in the Whip's department, which I was very excited to take because I was going to be responsible for steering government policy through the Commons with regard to housing. Great role for me, I thought. That was February 2020. 6 weeks later, COVID rode into town and turned all of our worlds upside down. And the legislation that I ended up working on initially was that stopped evictions for residential and for commercial premises, which was vital at that obviously difficult time. Meanwhile, the rest of the department was keenly focused on the idea of getting nearly 5,000 people as quickly as they could off the streets and into safe and secure accommodation. Now, as that first wave of the pandemic was coming to an end, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson was desperate to kickstart the economy. And he thought one of the best ways to do that would be to reinvigorate house building in this country. He promised the greatest reform of planning legislation since the Second World War. And you would think, if this had been delivered, this in itself would be a great way to prevent homelessness. So he tasked the then Secretary of State, Rob Jenrick, with the job of delivering this legislation. Rob went off, he came back a couple of months later with his Planning for the Future white paper. A plan that would implement top-down targets for councils across the country to make sure that they understood what the government expected of them and to get them building as many houses as possible. Sounds like a great plan, but unfortunately, as Mike Tyson once said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's exactly what happened, unfortunately, from one of our own Conservative MPs. Neil O'Brien, who is a mega brain, decided that he'd looked at this plan and he thought it was going to cause some problems for Conservative MPs in leafy suburbs in the southeast and in the outer London boroughs. He got together with an organisation called Litchfield's Planning Consultants. They got their calculators out. Neil called it the mutant algorithm. And they calculated how many houses would be required in each constituency. And the answer for some of those constituencies in the leafy southeast was a lot. He told them they weren't happy at all. About 40 of them got together on a WhatsApp group and decided they were going to do everything they could to bring this legislation to a halt. Despite the best efforts of me and the then Housing Minister trying to talk them down, they were having none of it. Ultimately, that legislation then hit the skidders. Robert Jenrick got replaced by Michael Gove. Planning authorities across the country collectively took their foot off the pedal. Planning applications tanked and housing delivery tanked with it. Now, the new Labour government has also got those top-down targets, so it will be interesting to see how they get on, because there are some problems, should we say, with some of their figures. So Kensington, Chelsea, for example, built roughly 225 houses per year for the past 3 years. Their new target, 5,000 houses a year. How are they possibly going to deliver that? And also, we have councils who are doing a really good job. So Ealing Council built more houses in 22-23 than any other London borough. They built just over 2,000 houses. But Ealing gets 75 new housing applications per week. So the best performing borough in London building over 2,000 houses is getting 3,900 a year people coming to them asking for homes. How do we keep ahead of that? And so, you know, these are challenging times. But then that was my time as a whip. A year later, I was delighted to get the call saying I was now going to be the Minister for Rough Sleeping and Housing. Felt like a fantastic fit for me. We don't normally do that, putting ministers in areas where they've got some knowledge of how things work. And so, great job for me, and I was determined to put to use what I had learned during my time as a whip. And, as we've heard earlier from other people, data should be at the core of lots of what we do. Now, we all know the annual rough sleeping snapshot that between the start of October and the end of November, we use a very rigorous process to count the number of people on the street. Whether you agree completely with the methodology or not, at least it's consistent, and I think it gives us a wealth of data to use. Well, I was fascinated to find that the government was collecting lots of data from councils every month that I thought would be fantastic for people to be using to drive policy and for comparator councils to understand why is one doing better than another, given the fact that they've got similar demographics. So I went to see Rob Jenrick and said, we should be releasing this data. This would really help people in terms of policy planning. Now, Rob was in his first, and as it turned out, only job as a Secretary of State, and the last thing he wanted to do was release data that might have given people the impression that the government wasn't doing quite as well in a policy area as they might profess. And so he told me to go away. He wasn't interested in releasing the data. But I didn't give up. And when Rob got the boot, I went to see Michael Gove, who was in, I think, his 4th or 5th cabinet position, and had a lot more faith in his junior ministerial team. And he said, fine, if you think that's what we need to do, Eddie, off you go. Now, nothing moves quickly in government, and I'm glad that in the intervening period, the CHI team did some pilots in 5 areas across the country, and then we were able to start using that data from March 2023. So we got there in the end. Now, Michael helped me in that case, but he wasn't able to help me with my next request, because I desperately thought we needed to repeal the Vagrancy Act. It had been on the statute books for 200 years. It had no place in modern society. I'd been speaking to Home Office ministers trying to make this case, but there was some contention, and so it was proving difficult. But eventually, in February 2022, Kit Malthouse, one of the Home Office ministers, said from the dispatch box that we would repeal this act. But I knew that behind the scenes, things were grinding very slowly. There was a lot of resistance to this. So I said to Michael, can we go and see the Prime Minister and make our case to him directly? He said, no problem, we'll sort that out. We got an appointment, and off we trudged to number 10 to see Boris and a guy called Dougie Smith, one of his special advisors. So Michael and I make an impassioned case to the Prime Minister, and he nods, he seems interested, he asks a few questions, and we feel like we've got him on board. And then it's Dougie's turn. Now, if you've got time later, just Google Dougie and have a look at his Wikipedia page, and that will probably explain why the thing that happened next happened. So Dougie said, under no circumstances were we going to repeal this act. Bearing in mind, we'd already said we would do it. He said, under no circumstances we're going to repeal it, because he was hearing from shopkeepers who were tired of people aggressively begging in the high street, and he'd heard shopkeepers who come in the morning to open their shop, and there were people sleeping homeless in the entrance to their shop, and they should be able to phone the police and get those people arrested. I started laughing. I said to Dougie, so you think we've got the money to pay for the expensive prison accommodation for these people, but you don't think we could take the cheaper general needs accommodation option and just give them a home instead? Anyway, he simply wasn't interested. So the Prime Minister nodded, thanked us for our time, and off we went. And then the Prime Minister did what lots of ministers and Prime Ministers have done before them when faced with a difficult situation like this. He did nothing. I presume he just put a folder in a drawer somewhere and just decided to leave it there. Now, you might be thinking, well, of course that's the case, because you're one of those Tories and they don't care about this sort of thing. To which I would say, we're 16 months into this government and they haven't done anything yet. And there is the promise that they will do something in spring next year. So I'm desperately hoping that they do stand firm and they don't have the problems that we experience behind the scenes with other people giving that resistance. Now, it's not just national politicians who have a problem with prevention sometimes. Sometimes local politicians do too. When I joined YMCA in Birmingham in 2014, we were getting a lot of landlords coming to see us saying they'd converted their homes into multiple occupancy and could we provide the support element for their exempt supported accommodation. And we told them how much that would cost and they said, no, thank you. We'll find somebody who can do this cheaper. Thank you very much. I went to see Birmingham Council and said, over a number of years, and said, the pressure on this is just growing exponentially. We're getting a lot of people coming to see us. You need to do something about this. Fast forward to 2021, Birmingham Council Scrutiny Committee do a report on this, and then they accept that there's been a massive proliferation of this type of accommodation in some of the poorest part of the cities, in some of the most crime-ridden parts of the cities. In fact, it was so bad in Birmingham that organised crime had moved in because they realised what a lucrative business opportunity it was to offer exempt supported accommodation with next to no support. And so I was delighted to support Bob Blackman's bill to introduce legislation in this area, much needed legislation, and I'm delighted the government has recently been consulting on that, because boy do we need it. So some very small progress with regard to supported accommodation, but one area that I never had the opportunity to make any progress was with regard to temporary accommodation. So a year after I'd stopped being a minister, I was very excited to get a call from some civil servants I'd worked with in the department who said, Michael Gove wants you to do a review of temporary accommodation. He wants you to look at the existing legislation, enforcement opportunities, the tenant experience. We've identified a civil service team to support you in this work. We agreed the terms of engagement. Everything was ready to go. All we needed was a call from number 10 to say we could get on with it. And unfortunately, that call never came. And it seemed to be that number 10 decided that temporary accommodation was just an area they didn't really want to draw attention to. And that's where we ended up. Now, you might say again, well, that's you Tories, that's the way the world goes. But one of the things I was surprised when I read Michael Barber's book, How to Run a Government, which he wrote in 2015, was that he was watching the spending review announcements from 2005. And when he listened to the announcements, he spoke to some people and realised, although they'd have made the announcement, the government had absolutely no idea how they were going to deliver the things they just announced. And so this is a bit of a cautionary tale with regard to the fact that politicians' number one motive or driver is self-preservation. And so that's why it is so incredibly important. And we heard it from Will today, we've heard it from Leisure. It is incredibly important that when we are making a pitch to politicians, we are going to them with a very well-evidenced case that will make them understand in relatively simple terms exactly what a policy will deliver and what the expected outcomes should be, based on the fact that people have already researched and trialed this and can prove that it works. And that is how we collectively are going to influence the current government and hopefully drive political change. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie, for those provocative remarks. I'll ask the other panelists to join us on stage now. So as they arrive, we're going to have Stephen Elder from Centrepoint, Sarah Walters from Crisis, and Rachael O'Connor from the Greater Manchester Better Outcomes Partnership, or GMBOP. I dare you to not think of Hanson for the rest of the day as you're reflecting on this. And I'm going to ask each of them to kind of start us off by reflecting on what Eddie has kind of set us out as a provocation. In particular, how do we think about harnessing collective action, collective power to really get people to move and do prevention, which, as Eddie mentioned, there are 100 reasons why it's really hard to do. How have you seen that work in your work, and what are your reflections from Eddie's talk? I'm going to start with Rachael, and we'll go this way.
Thank you, thanks. I mean, I'd like to just start with saying that what really stood out for me was a John Denver fan. Also being a massive John Denver fan as well. But I think it really resonated what you're saying about the kind of pressures that we've got throughout the system. And, you know, the lack of housing, the amount of people that are approaching, the pressures on temporary accommodation, and the fact that, you know, this really means that we need to do more in that prevention space. You know, we don't have a choice in that space. But I think that there's a real reluctance and there's a real lack of focus on that. And I think that one of the things that, you know, for me really stands out is it's hard with prevention because it's often long term, it's often difficult to measure, you know, what is effective, what has actually worked and what hasn't. And I think that that's why a lot of the time the governments don't have that focus on that, you know, that prevention work, because it is very difficult. It's not something they can come out and say, look, we've got this really shiny solution. It's a one size fits all. We're just going to do this everywhere and this is going to solve the problem. It doesn't give those kind of sound bites. So, you know, but it is so important. And some of the work that we're doing, so the programme that I work on, we work across Greater Manchester, so we work in all 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester, and it's an upstream prevention programme for young people. And the structure of the way that the programme is delivered is it's an outcomes contract, and what that enables us to do is have flexibility. So working in that outcomes where, you know, we're focusing on preventing homelessness essentially and looking at that, you know, that wider outcome, but it creates a structure that has that flexibility. And what that means is that because we have that flexibility, we can actually work with the communities, and that includes, you know, other delivery organisations, you know, the individuals themselves as well, and create something that's really flexible, because in the prevention space there just simply isn't a quick solution, because if there was, I think, you know, somebody would have picked it up and done it. But it's about having that kind of flexibility to empower the community and empower those individuals to really, you know, be able to create something that works for them in their own circumstances.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Sarah, please.
Yeah, I mean, lots to thank Eddie for in your speech. Housing and homelessness, absolutely. Good to see the government's emphasis on house building. Really delighted that the Vagrancy Act is going to get repealed, and we've got a date for that because Crisis has campaigned very heavily around that, and also the exempt accommodation situation. I live in Birmingham. It's horrendous, 30,000 people in exempt accommodation. We need a solution for that. And the focus on TA is important. I'm here with some colleagues who work with local authorities in Built for Zero, and they would say, I think, that the sheer numbers of people presenting in temporary accommodation, the overwhelming nature of that is meaning that people, all they can do is crisis management. That's all they're doing is right into what's in front of them and not thinking about prevention. It made me think of a couple of things. One is that I don't think we should look to government to provide all the prevention solutions. So I think one of the things that is important that we don't look upwards in that regard. And the second thing connected to that is secondary prevention means something to us in terms of the language. We work in the sector or we research it. It doesn't mean a lot to people out there. If you said, what secondary homeless prevention, they would be like, no idea. So one thing I'm really proud that Crisis are involved with is the Homelessness Alliance. So that is we are convening a network of employers to enable them to exercise what we would see as secondary prevention, what they would see as good recruitment practices, good policy practices. And it came out of a piece of research that we did that showed that if employers, 42% of employers who were asked said that if they knew somebody was homeless or had a risk of homelessness, they would terminate their employment, which is a horrifying statistic. But then most of them also said, but that's because we don't know much about it and we don't know what to do. So the Homelessness Alliance, started off as a covenant, now it's an alliance, provides and asks employers to come on that journey around prevention. And it says, would you look at your policies, would you raise awareness within your organisation of what homelessness is, so that employees can have the opportunity to talk about it and not risk their job opportunities? Can you develop some policies around recruitment and internally which are going to help people who are at risk of homelessness? And can you have a think about offering opportunities to people to be able to come and work in your company who have themselves been homeless? And we've got about 70 employers so far signed up, big names like Lloyds Banking Group, like Specsavers, like Amazon, who signed up for it. And really, like, not two man and a dog, but two man and a Pizza Hut. We've got very small sole traders who are also signed up to it, who will adapt all those different pledges depending on their situation. But the idea of that is to have your housing situation and perhaps housing precarity is something that you talk about comfortably with your employer, who can then give you some tools to be able to assist with that. And we're really seeing that making a difference already in terms of employer retention and people being more able to say where they are with the help their employer can give them. And I think it shows that, so that's secondary homelessness prevention. But if you said to the employer, you're doing that, they would just say, we've got good work practices. That's what we're interested in. It's how we reframe it to make more people think they can be part of it.
Thank you, Sarah. And Stephen, to you.
Yeah, is this on? Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think for me, the thing that stands out is around temporary accommodation and actually the numbers of people who are becoming homeless. As we see from Centrepoint's data bank research, we have a constantly increasing number of people presenting. Last year was a 10% increase again on those figures. And so part of, with the prevention side, preventing people from having to use temporary accommodation of any sort. And as Rachel said there as well, the sort of, my mind's gone blank, sorry. As Rachel said, when we're thinking around prevention and the length of time it takes for us to get that research, within the upstream work that we're doing within Centrepoint, we're working in schools. And if we're delivering a piece of work to an 11-year-old, it's going to be 14 years in the future before we actually know definitively if we've managed to end homelessness for that young person. So the length of time really builds in. If we think 14 years in the future, that's going to be potentially 3 general elections. So what's the party who's in charge going to be like at that point? But what we can do at this point is really test. We can test to see what's working. And so the upstream work that we're undertaking in Centrepoint is doing that. We're testing it in 2 pilots, one in London, one in Manchester. We're working with the Rock Trust in Scotland, Aberdeen Foyer in Scotland. We're working with Clymai in Wales to test this, to see how this works on those smaller levels with smaller cohorts in schools. We're also encouraging other organisations to come on board and deliver this. Recently, Roundabout in Sheffield have come on board. But the idea is to try and put something in as far upstream as we can go, try and find those people who may be at risk in the future, put an intervention in at that space so that the necessity, they don't need to access those temporary accommodations. They have that support network, those people that they can trust in order to support them.
Well, I want to thank you all for those reflections. And, you know, we heard a few different things about flexibility, empowerment. We talked about what does secondary mean, what does upstream mean, and how do we build bigger coalitions of folks. And I think the next question that I have for all of you is, you know, what kind of tools and tactics are you seeing that are actually working to help engage those other sectors, whether they be employers or the faith community or education, many other sectors and folks that have big influence on people who are at risk of homelessness. What are you seeing in your work that's actually working to engage those people and position them to act? So I'm going to start with Eddie on that one and kind of what you're seeing from your position, and we'll take questions from there.
Well, I guess there are 2 organisations that I'm working with that I'm excited about what they're doing. So one of them is the Housing Network. They are the biggest providers of what's called CAS 3 accommodation for prisoners who would be discharged otherwise homeless from prison. And so provide them with short-term accommodation that allows them to stabilise their position before they then hopefully move on to more permanent and settled accommodation. So that's great work. But also I'm helping the Church of England develop social housing as well. And one of the programmes that we've got, we're looking at small modular accommodation, and that is actually being built by people who are on release from prison, getting engaged so that they can develop the skills that they need and get used to being in the work environment again. And I think both of those things are helping kind of bend the curve to move people in a better direction and therefore hopefully move them away from the type of area they might end up in and then back on that vicious circle of ending up back in prison.
Rachel, please.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a few things that work, but I think one of the key things for me, excuse me, in Manchester, we have something which is the Greater Manchester Homelessness Action Network, which is a network of organisations that work all across the sector, in lots and lots of different spaces that come together, share that practice. It's a real kind of space for, you know, smaller organisations to, you know, to be part of, as well as larger organisations as well. And I think that the real key for me is making sure that, you know, we're able to bring all these different organisations together, because I think that one of the challenges with prevention is, you know, there is no organisation that can solve this on its own. There is not even a sector that can solve it on its own. It needs to be a network across that picture. And I think, you know, some of the things that we've seen, some of the data from our young people, when in the sort of early stages of our programme, we saw that over 63% of young people said that their mental health was the biggest risk to their housing stability, and yet we're still in situations where in the main we're working in silo. Because of the way that we're structured, we were able to kind of bring in a specialist mental health partner to work as part of the programme. But I think, you know, the things that I really see that are working is where we've got that sort of flexibility and that network that we can say, okay, for this young person, this is what's going to work, and we need to be able to access that quickly at the right time. For this young person, it's going to be something completely different. So we need to be able to access that as well, rather than having things that are kind of, you know, set, well, we can only do this, and if that doesn't work, then yeah, we're not able to help that individual.
Yeah, and Terrace, I'm curious for you and your work with the Alliance, how does that flexibility look for employers? I know you talked a little bit about framing it in terms of language that they can understand and get behind. But what kind of other flexible things are you all seeing that employers are coming up with, or that you're helping them do to support folks?
Yeah, so I suppose it's a wide variety depending on the size of employer, and I guess we're really conscious that this isn't a contractual agreement we've got with the employers. It's a pledge or a promise that they're making to work towards making changes, and quite a lot of those changes might be cultural within an organisation, to develop the relationships and the communication that means that people feel more comfortable in talking about their own personal housing situation. So doing a couple of things that really strikes me. One was with Lloyds. We created for them an online module which just was like raising awareness of homelessness. So there's quite top line stuff around actually what do the numbers tell us about who is homeless. Always that pushback around homelessness is not just rough sleeping, and that constant challenge we have around explaining what that is and thinking about hidden homeless and what that also means as well. And so far, we've been told that about 25,000 of the Lloyds employees have done that, which is amazing for a really small team like ours to have had that sort of a reach. And you think even if just one of the people, each one of those people then speaks to one other person in their circle about, oh, I didn't realise that actually homelessness is more than rough sleeping. You started that change in people's mindsets, which makes talking about it hopefully quite a bit easier. The other work, we've done some other work, more sort of bespoke training we did for Amazon, who had a scheme where people who were care experienced were coming to work with them, and we did some training around that and something around trauma-informed working and psychologically informed environments and what that means as well. And that was also really helpful from their perspective to start the conversation being a bit different. And having homelessness is something that isn't, if people disconnect the person sitting outside Sainsbury's with a bottle from somebody who I'm struggling because I can't make my rent payment, and you make it hidden homelessness something much more able to be spoken about and talked about. And you help managers and people who are supervising people to have those really good conversations about it and to develop tools that means they can talk about it comfortably within that sort of framework of safety. You're much going to be more able to put in some prevention tools to stop people becoming homeless. And those organisations and smaller ones have developed things that like rent deposit schemes, helping, like in Lloyds in particular, they've had about 25 to 30 people who've approached people directly and said, I now actually think I understand now that I am about to be made homeless, and can you help? And Lloyds have done, credit to them, they've done some fantastic stuff, really direct interventions that have stopped people from having to leave their jobs and kept their employment over a tricky period until they could then get rehoused. So it's that individual approach, but also changing some of the culture and the language to make it easier for people to be able to access support they need.
And Stephen, one more question for you before I open it up to the floor. So be thinking of your questions if you have them. And it's very similar to what Sarah just said about language, and you mentioned the word upstream. I'm curious what that means to you and what kind of things you're seeing in your work that's upstream, that's really working to help set people up to act on prevention, as kind of like Sarah just mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. So where we get upstream from is from the prevention typology model, thinking around different forms of homelessness prevention, from universal models, upstream models, crisis and emergency models, and then preventing repeat homelessness sort of models. And with the Upstream project, there's a lot of upstream in this, I'm sorry. The Upstream project that Centrepoint runs sits sort of within the upstream area within that typology model. This model works in schools. We work with teachers, with the students in their classrooms. We run a survey that helps to identify people early, so that if we can identify them at that point when they're 11, 12, 13, where there are some levels of risk there, what can we put in place at that point? When we're talking around working with people in the community, this whole model has come from the Geelong project in Australia. And the Geelong model talks around having a community of schools and services. What can be put in place around each of those schools so that it can sort of cascade down into each of the families and each of those children. The other thing I think that we have found really interestingly within the project is the idea of that family unit and working in community with the parents, with the children, working with them as a group together. It's about that relationship, and especially as we know that relationship breakdown is the biggest cause of youth homelessness. Working in that space, either through a mediation model or a conflict resolution model or a family support model. We know having children is difficult, and especially when they hit teenage years, that can be tricky. And managing that communication between parents and their children together is really key. So involving the parents very much within that community, within their own support, can be key to that.
Great. Well, thank you all. So as promised, I will open the floor to questions. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand. We have roving mics as usual. We'll try to take 2 or 3 at once if we have anything specific. So I see one hand here. Thank you. In the center. And one here in the center as well after, and we'll be, so please just introduce yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. My name's Emma Story. I'm Director of Housing at an organisation called Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse. And I suppose my question has 2 parts to it that are linked but are separate. And the first is to what extent the interventions that you're delivering consider the needs of survivors experiencing domestic abuse when we consider that that's one of the leading causes of homelessness. I'm in particular interested in the project that you're doing with children and young people in schools around that. And also, you've all mentioned the concept of community, and I'm just wondering to what extent the broader community and involving communities contributes to the work that you're doing.
Thank you. And second question here.
Sorry, I apologise. I'm doing the thing when I'm asking 2 questions already, so sorry to the audience. But my name's Johnny Whitehead from Hearts Young Homeless, with the Youth Homelessness Charity in Hertfordshire. And we're very interested, as Stephen knows, in joining in the Upstream project. But my questions for Rachel was can you tell us a little bit more about how long it took to develop the Homeless Action Network in Greater Manchester, and sort of how high up the political structure the support for that came from? Like, did that have to come from the very top or not? And yeah, how long did it take to get that network up and running? Because I'd be really interested in that in Hertfordshire.
Well, Rachel, I'll let you take that one first, because it's
Okay.
very specific,
Yeah.
and then I'll open to the group to answer the first question about including domestic abuse as well as involving those kind of communities in the discussion. So go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say, in answer to your question of how long, a very long time. There are some colleagues here that are also part of the network. I don't know if anybody knows the exact answer as to how long, but I think really, it's a very long time, and it's also ongoing, and it's organic, and it's about continuing with developing that, building it, looking at it. We've recently gone through an exercise looking at kind of remodelling, actually, is the structure the way that it is at the moment? Does that work? Is it achieving what, the network was set out to do? So I think, it is something that has to have a lot of involvement, and it has to come from all levels. So there absolutely needs to be support. And obviously in Greater Manchester, as I'm sure you all know, we have a very supportive mayor who is very focused on homelessness and has been very, very supportive of the network. But also there's a community and there's a willingness right throughout Greater Manchester to change things and to do something differently, and to also share and learn and work together. And I think that there is a danger, not just of silos, but also of this kind of trap of, competing against each other as sort of organisations. And I think that, there's a real willingness across Greater Manchester to leave that behind and say, actually, this problem is big, and we do all need to work together. And we all need to be open and really sort of honest around where things haven't worked. And I think that's something that I've not seen previously so much as I have seen as part of this network, and say, right, we've tried this and this hasn't worked. So, it sort of helps that others don't have to then try that as well. And then the final thing is that just having that really, really strong, voice of lived experience, because I think that, coming back, on the question before as well, what works, we really need to be asking individuals that have had that experience what has worked for you and what would have been better, what would have worked for you at an earlier point, so that we can really feed that learning in as well.
Great, thanks for that. Anyone want to take also that question, or the first question around involving domestic abuse and communities themselves?
I'll take a bit to Emma's questions. This is a really important one, and part of the materials and training that we offer as part of the Alliance will talk about the fact that not everybody, in terms of people becoming homeless, not everybody is at equal risk, and there are some people who are more at risk than others, and particularly about that intersectionality point will be made as part of that training, so that it made clear. We did a piece of work and a report on 75 ways to prevent homelessness, of which quite a few of those were in that domestic abuse field, and the resource for that is on our website. But it sort of went back a little bit to the point of people the language not being always very helpful in terms of they wouldn't have called themselves a homeless prevention service, but actually what they were doing was stopping people's homelessness by the actions that were being taken in the various examples that are in there. So I probably would direct you to that as well. And just to say, in the very large employers, they've often got domestic abuse policies that address that, and they are developing homelessness policies as well, and it's making sure those intersect and read across to each other, and are seen as part of the whole as well, so it's very much part of that picture as well.
I just wanted to come in on the point about community. I think I am personally terrified to a degree with the direction of travel the country seems to be taking, and the rise of more hard right politics. Although, as part of my work with the Church of England, I've had to go and visit an awful lot of churches up and down the country, and they are telling me that they are seeing more people, not necessarily coming into the church from a faith perspective, but with the community groups that they run, they're seeing attendances rising. And so I feel somewhat heartened by the idea that there might be, as an antidote to the rise of the right, that there might be a burgeoning rise in terms of community interaction, because personally, some of the best money that I ever signed off as a minister was going to very small charities, faith and community groups, because I think they were doing great work, but they were just doing it in small micro areas that perhaps they didn't get the recognition they need. So I'm heartened by the fact that although I've got some fear on one side, I just feel there is going to be a genuine reaction from those who really care on the other side of the equation, and maybe we will just end up seeing the very best of society, and that will come through a community focus.
Well, thank you, Eddie. And we're about at time. I have one last question for all of you, and I'm going to give you a prompt. One takeaway for the room, hopefully in less than 10 or 15 seconds. I have my watch. But one prompt for each of you, and just what would you like folks to walk away from this session with if you had one thing that you had to choose? You get the task to start us off, Stephen, so good luck. I'll give you a second to think, and then we'll go down the line and Eddie to end.
I think, and it goes to what we've all talked around on the stage today, is around that community and the different things that are happening in the different areas, the different organisations, the different sectors that are all involved and can be further involved within homelessness prevention.
Gosh, homeless prevention doesn't sit in homelessness departments, it sits in wider society, and we can all play our part in that.
For me, it's flexibility and creating anything that we do, having the flexibility to be able to put that person really at the centre and then build something around them rather than us developing something and putting it on people.
Like my example of the Sky TV package, or Lisa's example of the boiling saucepan, getting it before it boils over the edge, I think we need to make a collective case to get early interventions, because that's where they're more likely to be A, effective, and B, cheaper. And so that should be a win-win for politicians.
Amazing. Well, that was one of the first times ever that prompt was actually accomplished. So I will appreciate you all for that. But please join me in thanking the panelists for their wonderful contributions.
Thank you.